Three. All righty. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. And so happy. And actually, before I introduce my guest, I just want to I just want to say once more, I give my heart, empathy, compassion, companionship, and all my love and best to Rania Khalek, Manar Adli, Rania Masri, Julia Khassem, Dr. Mara Osman, and Laith Maruth, all of whom have been on the show before, at least once or twice. And all of these people are either based in Lebanon or have innumerable family, friends, colleagues, comrades, close communities. And while three of the people I mentioned aren't based in Lebanon, I'm praying that their home has been unharmed and that those dearest to them are all right, or as best as one can be, considering the state terrorism of Western-backed Israel. And good news is that Dr. Mara Osman is all right. And both Rania Khalek and Rania Masri are in the U.S., but that's about as much as I know. That's what's going on with them. And Julia Khassem is also okay. So on to anyways, on to the guest of the hour. Or 40-something minutes. My guest for this edition of One Plus One is Dimitri Lascaris, Canadian lawyer, independent journalist, environmentalist, eco-socialist, anti-imperialist, and social justice activist. He was a Green Party of Canada leadership candidate, and though he didn't win, he got second place consistently through the ranked choice voting scheme of the GPC. He's a member of Disruption Canada, a founding member of Green Left Canada, former Real News correspondent and board member. He often covered the climate crisis, Canadian affairs, and Greek and Palestinian and international affairs. He's now a full-time independent journalist hosting his own program and substack called Reason to Resist. And we welcome back our returning champion on One Plus One, Dimitri Lascaris, the compassionate gentleman. Welcome back, Dimitri.
That's a very flattering, kind, and detailed introduction. Thank you very much, Youri. It's always a pleasure speaking to you.
It is such an honor.
You're a delightful host. Delightful. Thank you.
Thank you. And it's such an honor to have you back, Dimitri. And let's get into the current affairs. This is going to be a current affairs episode. Now, but before we talk about your trip in Lebanon and what the horrors that Israel is inflicting on Lebanon and the ongoing genocide towards the Palestinians, not just in Gaza, but also in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, I have to ask you this question, which is, you were an election observer in Venezuela. You don't have to talk too much about it, but can you talk to us a bit about your time in Venezuela and why, the West's accusation and the broad Western-backed far-right opposition that Maduro cheated is a bunch of, BS?
Yeah, so let me first of all say what I saw was not in and of itself sufficient. What I personally observed was not in and of itself sufficient to give a conclusive assessment of the legitimacy of the election. One person can't possibly do that alone. So you have to look at the totality of the evidence. What I saw was I went to two polling booths. There were people lined up at one of them. The other one, when we showed up, there were very few people voting. Some people showed up, but we showed up in the latter part of the afternoon, and they told us that pretty much everybody who was eligible to vote in that part of the city, which was on the edge of Caracas, had voted already. But the other one, there was a very long line. We walked in, we saw absolutely no form of coercion. The voting methodology, we had somebody walk us through how you actually cast a vote, what is then done with the ballot, what is the process for auditing it. And it seemed to me to be a highly robust and reliable and transparent system of electoral, of counting votes and enabling people to cast their votes free of any coercion and in a private manner. So what I witnessed was comparable to or better than what I've seen in any other country. So that's what I can say from my personal experience. Also, I can say that I walked the streets of Caracas and I didn't see anybody, engaging in any kind of behavior on behalf of the government, which suggested that there was any kind of a coercive environment. And all of the election observers who were there with me, I interacted with, there were hundreds of them there. I interacted with dozens of them myself. Their observations were the same. right? No one I spoke to raised any concerns about what they had witnessed at polling booths throughout the city of Caracas. Now, if you look at the way the electoral system works in Venezuela, it has generally received very high grades from international election observers. This time, however, there was a claim because there were exit polls done by an American firm that has ties to the U.S. Government.
Yeah.
That suggested that the opposition had won by a substantial margin. And so they said, this is a fraud. And various parties, including the Western government, said the only way that you can reconcile these exit polling results with the actual numbers is to publish the poll-by-poll results. So each polling station would publish the results. Now, as a matter of Venezuelan law, the government is not required to do that. And that's as far as I know, been the case for a long time.
Yeah.
So every country has, and I believe, I haven't been following the news in Venezuela lately because of what's been going on in West Asia. I believe that they haven't published those results. In Canada, they make them available. They don't actually go out and publish them, and you have to ask for them, and they're not immediately available, but they are available in some jurisdictions when you request them. But there was, a certification of the election results by the Supreme Court, and everybody says, well, the Supreme Court is controlled by Nicolas Maduro. And then you say, well, why is that? Why do you say it's controlled by Nicolas Maduro? Well, because the president chooses the judges. Well, guess what? That's what happens in Canada and the United States.
Well, yeah, and that's what happens when people elect whatever government, that president or whomever, appoints whomever they think is fit to run a high court or any judicial branch.
And I could tell you, Youri, after having litigated for 30 plus years, been a lawyer for 30 plus years in Canada and the United States, that the judges who are appointed to the bench in these countries where I've lived reflect the ideological orientation of the judges, of the politicians who appoint them. Absolutely. There's no, of all the judges I've interacted with in Canada and the United States, I have never encountered a radical leftist, not a single one. Not a single one. They all think
NDP one.
not even I forget about radical leftists, just a leftist, not even one. Maybe there's a small number of people you could legitimately characterize as modest social democrats, but there's nobody who's really left-wing, nobody who's a socialist, certainly nobody who's a communist, nothing like that. They all are people who are aligned ideologically with the two parties who have monopolized or duopolized politics in the West. In Canada, it's the Liberals and Conservatives. In the United States, of course, it's the Republicans and the Democrats. They are an ideological reflection. So why people say that this is, Nicolas Maduro has some kind of a stranglehold over this Venezuelan Supreme Court, it really is a mystery to me. In any event, that's my assessment of it. There's really no evidence. I don't trust that exit poll because of the people who promulgated it. I trust the Venezuelan electoral system and the Electoral Commission and the Venezuelan Supreme Court much more than I trust those characters, and I believe that the result reflects the will of the Venezuelan people.
And very briefly, when do you think the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war is going to end, and why is it still in this sort of grotesque stalemate? And I know a comrade of yours, Tamara Lawrence, has also been to Russia to speak with Russians across the political spectrum, and she's going to be doing a couple of speaking tours like what you did when you were trying to say to people, this is how we end the war in Ukraine. So very briefly, I'm curious, why do you think this war is still ongoing, and why is it in the grotesque stalemate between the two parties?
Yeah, I think it's over, frankly. I mean, in the sense that Ukraine is defeated. It's absolutely defeated. If you follow the military reports coming from multiple sources, from the Russians, from the Ukrainians, from independent military experts, you analyze. I spend a significant time every day, and I've been doing this since the military intervention began, reading reports from multiple sources about what's happening in the battlefield. Today, and yesterday, as a matter of fact, I was in a webinar with 8 people who are very knowledgeable about the subject. It was a closed webinar where a former pilot in the Soviet Air Force, the Ukrainian Air Force, and the Canadian Air Force, who just went to Ukraine, presented to us, he gave us a presentation on what he saw while he was there, and he was on the Ukrainian side. And all of the evidence shows, in my opinion, that the Ukrainian army is in a state of collapse. The Russian forces are advancing all over the front line. They have complete air supremacy. They have a massive advantage in artillery, which is extremely important. So, for example, I interviewed the other day Dan Kovalik, a U.S. law professor who just went to the Donbass. So the former Ukrainian, Soviet, Canadian pilot was on the Ukrainian side. Dan Kovalik was on the Russian side in the Donbass, and both of them gave an account which was perfectly consistent with what I've gleaned from the reports, which is that the Russians are rapidly advancing all over the front line. The Ukrainian military is in a state of collapse, and Russia has air supremacy, has a much larger combat capability, much more voluminous artillery stocks. And I think it's just a matter of, at this stage, sadly to say, finishing off what remains of the Ukrainian army. And not to mention that Ukrainians' energy infrastructure has been largely destroyed, and they're heading into a winter. So the country is in a terrible state. They still have the capacity to kill a lot of people. Sure, they have enough weaponry to, inflict significant casualties on the Russians, but the trajectory of this war is clear. Ukraine is lost. And the longer it goes on, the more Ukraine will lose territory. That's the reality.
Okay, and then before we start talking about Lebanon and Palestine, is it safe to say then that Ukraine, as we know it, is no longer going to exist, with East Ukraine being part of the Russian Federation, or certainly its own quasi-independent country, and West Ukraine, which with Kiev as its capital, being aligned with the West?
Well, I think it's clear that Russia will retain control of most, if not all, of the 4 oblasts it has annexed formally, namely Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson. It may actually end up taking more territory than that, particularly in the north, in the Sumy region, where the Ukrainian military a few weeks ago launched a disastrous, incursion to Russian territory. They're just getting absolutely annihilated up there now in the Kursk region. They actually hold some territory as well in the Volchansk area, which is it's up in the north, but it's to the east of Kursk. So they may end up holding more territory than those 4 oblasts. And of course, they're not going to give up an inch of Crimea. I think it's a virtual certainty that Ukraine will not, within my lifetime at any rate, recover any of that territory. The Russians aren't going to give it up, and the Ukrainians don't have the capacity to take it back. And you even see recognition of this the Czech president, who is a hardcore Russophobe, pro-NATO, Pavel, his name is, started saying publicly for the first time a few weeks ago that Ukraine's government needs to be realistic, and it's going to have to make territorial concessions. As for the rest of Ukraine, I think I can't imagine that Russia will allow what remains of Ukraine, to become a member of NATO. I don't think they're going to allow it. And okay. if the West insists upon it, then the war will just go on until the Russians have not only defeated the Ukrainian military, but they've replaced the government there. They will put in power. They'll go to that extent. They will put in power a government that is prepared to accept no NATO membership for what remains of Ukraine. And whatever one may say about the legality of that, when you look at the behavior of NATO over the past several decades, how can we not understand why the Russians don't want NATO troops and NATO missiles on their border? I wouldn't. I'm not saying that I would have made the same decisions that Russia's president had made, but I would regard that as an existential threat to my country. And that's exactly what the entire Russian political elite, William Burns, who's currently the CIA director when he was the ambassador to Russia, before becoming the CIA director, sent a cable which was leaked to the public by WikiLeaks, in which he said the entire Russian political elite, right across the political spectrum, regards NATO membership for Ukraine as an existential threat to the Russian Federation. That's the way they view it, and it's understandable given NATO's behavior.
Wow, unbelievable. Well, that conversation is going to have to be continued. I'm going to have to definitely invite you and another person on to devote a whole time to Ukraine, Russia. Now on to West Asia, the Middle East. So Dimitri, I was saying to you off the air that one of these days we're going to also have to do an entire show on Greece and also Cyprus. But one simply cannot ignore the ongoing horrors that's taking place in the Middle East or West Asia. And you've wait, hold up. And now you've been to Palestine, you've been to Syria, I believe you're in touch with people from Lebanon, and you've been devoting your journalism going to some of these war-torn places and cemeteries of Western imperialism. So can you talk to us about your time in Lebanon, which is currently being met by vicious state terrorism and destruction the the state of Israel? And my follow-up question to that is what can you tell us about what's going on in Lebanon, what you've witnessed, and any sacred historical and cultural sites that you know that Israel has simply destroyed?
So I have been to Lebanon 5 times since the beginning of 2023. The first time I went was before October 7th of last year. And I went there primarily I'd never been to Lebanon before, and I just wanted to see what condition the country was in, primarily as a result of the economic crisis. It was suffering already at that point from hyperinflation. I think half the population was living in poverty. The electricity system had collapsed. It was providing maybe a few hours of electricity a day. People were basically getting most of their electricity from generators if they could afford them. And I did, while I was there, go to the Shatila refugee camp, which was the Palestinian refugee camp in Beirut, which was the site of a horrific massacre under the Sharon regime, perpetrated by the Israeli proxy, the Phalangists. And I spoke to Palestinians there. And I did go to the southern border. But at that point, the southern border was quiet, even though it was tense. And there's a wall separating much of South Lebanon from occupied Palestine. And that wall, not surprisingly, sits on Lebanese land, not on Israeli land. I saw that wall. I threw a rock over it symbolically, but it was quiet. And people were going about their daily lives. I saw a lot of, monuments, memorials, and other mementos of past conflicts with Israel. There's people in the South Lebanon very, very proud of their resistance to Israel. Very tough people, very inured to war. So I got that sense from being there. I also visited, by the way, a site at which Israeli soldiers had tortured Lebanese people during the occupation. I went to the site of the Kana massacre, where a soon-to-be Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett commanded a unit that bombed a NATO facility that was housing displaced persons and killed dozens of them. So there were signs of the Israeli barbarism all over the place, but it was relatively peaceful. And then I went again promptly after October 7th. Went to Beirut, again to South Lebanon. And what prompted me to go there was that Hezbollah called for a day of rage. Hassan Nasrallah, the now assassinated Secretary General, because Israel was making noises about committing genocide in Gaza. So I got off the plane and I went directly to the site at which this day of rage was a protest was to take place, which was the U.S. Embassy in Beirut. And when I got there, it was all hell had broken loose. There were thousands of people who were charging Lebanese forces who were standing between them and the Israeli embassy. And they were throwing rocks at the soldiers, and the soldiers were firing rubber bullets, and some of them were throwing the rocks back. It was just complete mayhem. And then I went to the south and saw that combat had erupted, and you could see and hear artillery explosions, drone explosions, and so forth. And I saw some destroyed infrastructure. After that, I went 3 more times. My most recent visit was last weekend. I was in Beirut 1 week ago. And at each stage, the destruction of civilian infrastructure has been worse. Entire buildings leveled to the ground, medical centers demolished. A lot of buildings around areas that had been where a building had been demolished, the surrounding infrastructure often sustains very serious damage, so much so that they become uninhabitable. I saw that Dahia had been, which is a population of 800,000 normally, and it's the one part of Beirut that has been most targeted by Israeli forces. It's been rendered a ghost town. Almost everybody has left. There were displaced persons everywhere. People sleeping. I mean, of course, there were homeless people before because of the economic crisis, but this was far beyond anything I had seen. People sleeping in the streets with their kids, people having put up tents on sidewalks, many people living in their cars, which they had parked wherever they could find a parking space in Beirut. We visited areas where the displaced were being housed in schools and churches. We spoke to people who are, making thousands of meals a day in order to feed them. And this time I wasn't able, this was the one trip where I wasn't able to get out of the city and go to the south because the war has intensified to a point in the south where you simply can't access the area. So it's very clear that Israel is trying to inflict upon Lebanon what is known as the Dahia Doctrine. And that's to say, which takes its name from that suburb that I visited, Dahia. The essence of the doctrine is you inflict so much suffering on the civilian population that they either rebel or by peaceful means, if possible, they replace their leadership with one that will capitulate and will do the bidding of Israel and its Western backers, will submit. That's the essence of the doctrine. And the problem with this doctrine is it fails miserably every single time. And what in fact it does is it angers the population, radicalizes the population, it becomes a recruitment tool for resistance groups. And yet Israel keeps using the doctrine, and the killing of the political and military leaders of these organizations. Israel's been doing this for decades. It hasn't stopped the resistance. They replace them, and sometimes they replace them with people who are more capable and more radical. So the only way to bring an end to this, Youri, is to give the Palestinian people justice and freedom. That's it. Any other approach is going to end in failure.
That's a perfect segue then to this question. Now, Israel's rationale for its attacks on Lebanon, Israel has basically de facto invaded again southern Lebanon to try to eradicate Hezbollah, which is the Lebanese Shia nationalism armed movement and political movement, because they have members in the Lebanese parliament, which only came about. So Hezbollah only came about because of Israel's invasion of southern Lebanon during the Lebanese Civil War. So you can correct me if I'm getting wrong any of this. Now, Israel itself backed a far-right Christian faction movement in the Lebanese Civil War. It was trying to do its own sort of dirty divide and conquer strategy and has what's called the Greater Israel Plan. Now, Hezbollah, I believe Hezbollah has attacked Israel, or certainly has called for Lebanese people and people of the region of West Asia to assist the Palestinians in their resistance to Israel's settler colonialism and stop the genocide that we are seeing happening daily. Now, I wanted to ask you, is there anything in international law that says countries or other actors have a right to help out an occupied people resist their oppressors? Ergo, Israel can claim it's defending its sovereignty and its people from terrorism by Hezbollah, but international law is clearly on the side of the Palestinians in their efforts at resisting Israeli oppression. And Hezbollah, even the Lebanese army, has every right to defend Palestinian people and even the rights of their own self-defense, since we know Israel isn't just some innocent bystander in Lebanese affairs, given all we know about Israel being a partner in crime to Western imperialism and its own evil imperialistic goals towards its neighbors in the region and elsewhere. So I'm curious your response
Right.
to all of that.
So Hezbollah was not born in the Civil War. It was born during the Israeli occupation of Lebanon, and it came into existence as a resistance force. And its ultimate goal was to expel Israeli forces from Lebanon, who were there illegally in a war of aggression. As I mentioned, as you mentioned as well, Israel used the far-right so-called Christian phalangists as a proxy. There were others, I think, it used as proxies to commit atrocities and do its bidding in Lebanon. And ultimately, the Israeli forces were expelled. They tried again to invade Lebanon. They were expelled in 2000. They tried again to invade Lebanon in 2006. The Israeli military was humiliated in a 5-week war and ended up withdrawing without disarming Hezbollah or removing it north of Litani River. And on this occasion, what happened was there have always been, sporadic skirmishes over the years since 2006, but nothing that one would call a war. What happened was when Israel, began to respond to the October 7th attacks in a genocidal manner, Hezbollah began to attack Israel military bases, not civilian population centers, military bases. And the Secretary General of Hezbollah was quite clear why they were doing that. They were doing that to draw Israeli military forces to the north, away from Gaza, to make it easier for the underarmed and outnumbered militants in Gaza to resist the invasion, the genocidal rampage of the Israeli military. And they did that. The Hezbollah, by attacking military bases in the north in a relatively restrained way, forced the Israelis to divert large numbers of their troops and their military hardware and weaponry up to the north. So as to the legality, and over time it's intensified. And Israel has had to evacuate something in the range of, I don't know exactly what the number is, 100,000 settlers from northern communities.
And we're talking about illegal settlers, right?
As far as I'm concerned, they're all illegal settlers, but
hence
unless they were,
why it's called historic Palestine. But yeah,
correct,
go on,
yes.
go on.
So in any event, this is having a significant burden, by the way, on the Israeli government, the Israeli economy, having to keep these people housed and fed and schooled away from their homes in the north. So in any event, as to the legality of all of this, it is very clear there's a genocide going on. Mm-hmm. It's absolutely crystal clear. And this has been clear from virtually the October of last year.
Since the Nakba.
Yeah, well, exactly. I would go as far as to say that genocide was going on before October 7th of last year. But when you have the Israeli defense minister standing up and saying, as he did right away after October 7th, we're dealing with human animals and we're going to deprive the whole population of Gaza of water and food, and they have no way of sustaining themselves without humanitarian aid, is very clear what the intention is. The intention is to wipe out at least a large part of the civilian population. That's a genocide. And you had other statements coming out of, like, the president of the Israel, Herzog, saying there are no innocents in Gaza. They're all guilty, even the children. He didn't say that, but he said there are no innocents in Gaza. So the inference is even babies, toddlers, are culpable and are legitimate targets for the military. And since then, the military has acted in accordance with these statements. They've been killing children en masse, probably tens of thousands of them at this stage. So what does Hezbollah do? So from a practical perspective, because the US government and its Western partners, I would prefer to refer to them as vassals, I think that's a more accurate term, mm-hmm. refuse to end the delivery of military equipment to Israel, no matter what atrocities Israel commits against Palestinian civilians, and is doing everything else in terms of economic aid, political cover, legal assistance, blocking action by international organizations like the UN Security Council, The only way, practically speaking, for those who support the Palestinian people and respect their human rights to help them is by armed intervention. That's it. They've tried to take action at the United Nations. The prosecutor of the ICC has asked for arrest warrants, okay, against Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, the defense minister. We've been waiting for like 4 months now for those arrest warrants to be issued. He waited way too long to ask for them, and now they're taking months to issue them. They took something like 3 weeks to issue an arrest warrant at the ICC against Vladimir Putin. What's going on here is far worse than what's being alleged against Vladimir Putin.
Yeah.
So
and that's even if you don't even agree with Russia's actions in Ukraine.
Correct. So even assuming it's all true, but all the allegations are true, it's not near. He's alleged to have taken children, kidnapped children out of a war zone. Okay, and no one's saying that he massacred the children, and they in fact can easily demonstrate, the Russians, that those children are being cared for. But the allegation though is he had no right to take them out of the war zone. Let's suppose they're right about that. Are you going to put that on the same level with massacring tens of thousands of Palestinian children, intentionally killing them? I mean, come on. And still the ICC won't act. We've had decisions from the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, the world court, highest court in land in the world. Israel's thumbed its nose at those decisions, consistently violated the orders of that court. People are trying, to mount boycott divestment programs to bring the Israelis to heel. Hasn't changed the Israeli behavior at all. What's left? Armed resistance. Now, under Article 1 of the Genocide Convention of 1948, which is a fundamental principle, legal treatise, instrument of international law, it has the highest status, erga omnes status in international law. All state parties have an obligation to prevent genocide, not simply to punish it, not simply to refrain from doing it, but to prevent it. And this is a positive obligation. So Hezbollah is looking at the situation and saying, not just Hezbollah, there are militias in Iraq. There's the government of Iran, which is a state party to the Genocide Convention. Then there's the Ansar Allah movement, the de facto government of Yemen. All of them are saying, you will not act. Israel is thumbing its nose at the international legal system. You keep arming Israel. We are going to do the only thing we can do to save the Palestinian people. We are going to attack Israel's military forces, not a civilian population, it's military forces, to try to bring this to an end. In my opinion, they have pretty strong arguments as to the legality of what they're doing. Now, if they do target innocent civilians, that in and of itself may well constitute a violation of international law, depending upon the circumstances. Are they truly innocent? Are they being targeted, or were they incidentally injured as a result of an attack on a military target? Those questions would have to be looked at. But of course, I'm not arguing for that. I'm not advocating for that. I'm not saying that's legal. I'm talking about attacks on Israel's military. What else are they supposed to do? Sit back and watch the international community allow the Palestinian people to be annihilated? No, no person of conscience would say that.
I was just talking very briefly to a frequent guest on this show, Alfred Zayas, and I was asking Alfred Zayas, who, he's practiced international law, he teaches international law, and he also emphasizes the inconvenient truths, which is in international law. And I asked him, okay, Israel says it has the right to defend itself and to stop terrorism, whether it's in Lebanon, and Israel will say that the Lebanese government isn't doing anything to stop Hezbollah, hence why we have to bomb Beirut and southern Lebanon and even try to reoccupy the country. And Zayas responded very briefly saying, Israel's committing genocide, and like Hezbollah, international law is on its side to stop what they're doing to the people of Gaza and the rest of the occupied territories. So all that being said, here's hoping Lebanon will be able to unite and push back against Israel and not fall for what Israel is trying to do, which is to get the Lebanese people to fight amongst themselves, or the Lebanese to throw Hezbollah under the bus, as well as the Palestinians. But if we talk about Palestine, historic Palestine, Israel, the ongoing genocide, Holocaust taking place in Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, there was a huge legal victory that took place in the international court. I like you. I don't agree with its entire ruling, but they said that Israel is guilty of genocide and other crimes against humanity, and that Benjamin Netanyahu and either the head of the army or the defense minister, you can correct me if I'm wrong there, must face trials in The Hague along with Hamas leadership. Although Israel's murdered most of Hamas's leadership now. Now, South Africa led this charge, and several other
So
countries.
I just correct you. So
Yes,
it's
yes, yes. Go
to be
ahead.
clear. So there are two courts that have, well, one has been called upon to intervene but has done nothing yet, and another one has been called upon to intervene and has acted. So the one that has done nothing yet is the International Criminal Court, the ICC. The ICC is not a creature of the United Nations. The ICC was created by a separate treaty called the Rome Statute, to which not all states are party. So, for example, Russia is not a party to the ICC, to the Rome Statute. China isn't a party. The United States isn't a party. Israel isn't a party. But most countries are. And this is a very Western-dominated organization. And what it does is it prosecutes individuals for war crimes and crimes against humanity, and has never laid a finger on any Western leader, military or political, for the many, many war crimes and crimes against humanity that they've perpetrated since the ICC was created about 22 years ago. Mm-hmm. Then you have the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, which is an institution established by the United Nations Charter, to which pretty much every state in the world is a party. That deals with states, not individuals, okay? So the ICJ has rendered some preliminary judgments. It hasn't determined that Israel is committing genocide. It determined that it's plausible that Israel is committing genocide, and that gives rise to a duty to prevent genocide, and it imposes certain obligations on Israel, one of which was for it to stop attacking Gaza. So it issued preliminary orders. There hasn't yet been a final judgment. That's going to take years. There will be a trial one day in the ICJ, but that trial will concern it won't render judgment against individuals, but against the state of Israel. And then you have the ICC, which has not lifted a finger yet, as I said. So that's sorry to clarify.
No, but that's actually very important clarification. So I'm actually glad that you've enlightened us about that. And I know several other countries, notably Nicaragua, they've been saying, and I think they've even been trying to take countries like Germany, my father's country of the Netherlands, they say that they should be facing charges for their complicity in Israel's epic crime against humanity. And there are Canadian lawyers who think that Canada should be charged as well. Briefly, because there's lots of other important stuff I want to talk to you about. So briefly, what are your views on this, and what are some of your criticisms actually about even some of the charges, and even things like it's plausible Israel's committing
right.
all that stuff?
Well, I think the ICJ has done, more or less the best that it can do. It can't render a final judgment until there's a full-blown trial, and that's going to require a lot of evidence to be accumulated, much of which is not available because, investigators can't access Gaza. So typically these trials take years to litigate. But the ICC is an absolute disgrace, not even to issue arrest warrants. I mean, I think they should just abolish the ICC. I think it is a Western-dominated tool of imperialism, and it's a disgrace to the concept of justice and the rule of law. The fundamental problem, though, with the ICJ, even though I more or less commend it for its decisions in this matter, is that enforcement of its decisions requires action by the UN Security Council. There isn't a police force or an army commanded by the judges of the International Court of Justice. The fatal flaw, of course, in the UN Security Council, which is we have to rely upon to enforce these decisions, is that states have a veto power. And
who are those states? France, Britain, and the United States. And
right.
although people will say, well, Russia and China and their rival imperialist and rival capitalist countries, but basically there's only so much they can do with veto powers. Like if America is waging aggressive wars on, Iraq and other places. But basically,
Yeah.
that's House of Lords, that's sort of, unelected Canadian Senate, which is, the Security Council. Yeah, it's America, France, and and Britain that dominated and get to do whatever they want, come what may, and even protecting Israel.
Yes.
And
So I just want to
yeah,
say one other thing, Yuri. That's not the only legal alternative available to those of us who care about the Palestinian people. There are also the domestic courts of our countries. And in fact, I and a team of other lawyers, 6 other lawyers, are going to launch a case in the next few days, probably, against the Canadian government, alleging that the government is violating its obligation under Article 1 of the Genocide Convention to prevent genocide. So hopefully, and that may take, unfortunately, years to litigate. We're going to try to do it as expeditiously as possible, but hopefully that will apply significant pressure on the Canadian government to respect the Genocide Convention. And there have been other actions begun in domestic courts. There was one that was attempted in the US, which was dismissed on technical grounds, even though the judge said, I agree with the ICJ. It's plausible Israel's committing genocide, but as a matter of US law, my hands are tied. There was a decision rendered in your home country, the Netherlands, barring the country from sending F-35 parts, I believe it was, to Israel. So the domestic courts are another avenue, but they're slow. The legal regimes are not particularly helpful in a number of these countries, and the judges aren't necessarily the most sympathetic to the Palestinian cause.
exactly. That's a perfect segue then to this question, which is, do you have any criticisms to give of China and Russia? These are two nations that also have special veto powers in the undemocratic United Nations. Miko Peled, Israeli historian and journalist and activist, contributor to Minpress News, has gone on record on Brianna Joy's program, I believe. Anyways, but Miko Peled has gone on record criticizing both Russia and China for not engaging in any major or even minor BDS on Israel. I'm curious to your response on that. Now, I think Russia's excuse is that they have a very large Jewish population that harbors Zionist viewpoints and has dual nationals who share both Israeli and Russian citizenship. China, however, doesn't have that electoral domestic problem, and Brazil they and India have we've yet to find both of those nations could do so much more in advancing a BDS agenda, and yet, not much. So I'm curious your response on that.
Well, it's a complex question. I definitely understand where Miko is coming from. They could do more, no doubt about it. They could impose severe sanctions on Israel. They could send, an armada of ships, in theory, and say, look, we're bringing humanitarian aid and into Gaza with our naval forces, and if you attack us, we will attack you, and to hell with you. And we're going to do everything possible to give the Palestinian people in Gaza the necessities of life. They could do that. They could attempt it. And they probably have the military ability to certainly give it the old college try, if not succeed. There are two problems, though, that I think they're confronting. I would love to see them do more, and I think they haven't done enough. But I think it's a bit easy for us to, imagine scenarios in which they are going to intervene in that manner. Why do I say that? When it comes to sanctions, China and Russia have consistently taken the position that the only sanctions that are lawful, and this is actually a principled position in my view, the only sanctions that are lawful under international law are those authorized by the UN Security Council. That's been their general position. Now, I would say that you also have to look at the Genocide Convention, and the Genocide Convention to which they are a party imposes an obligation to prevent genocide. So in my view, they don't have to wait for the UN Security Council to act when genocide is going on. That's a special case, and they should impose the harshest sanctions that they can on Israel's leaders. So there, I think there's legitimate criticism, but I think they're concerned. I don't think it's because, you know, because Russia has a large Jewish population. I think it's primarily because they don't want to be seen to be legitimizing the Western use of sanctions, which they think is wholly legitimate and extremely damaging.
Which they've not been even victims to on top of that, even without
right.
the United Nations
Right.
approval. But then I have to ask this.
But sorry, I
Yeah,
just want to say,
ahead,
but the military alternative is extremely dangerous one, because if you get into a shooting war with the United States, we could all end up dead. So it's
or
easy.
Israel, which also has nuclear weapons.
Correct. It's correct. It's easy to say, you know, go in there with an armada. I was actually saying it this at the very beginning, you know, but after a while, you start to see these lunatics, how crazy they are. We could end up in World War III. So, you know, I don't know. I'm torn on this question. But when you look at these statements that have come out, at least, and they're voting at the UN, they have voted consistently in favor of the anti-genocide position, the pro-Palestinian position, going back decades, not just since October 7th. And the statements that they're making are consistently critical of Israel, condemning US support for Israel, demanding you know, a ceasefire, demanding humanitarian aid for the Palestinians, and demanding a Palestinian state. So, you know, I wish they would do more. They should do more. I criticize them for not doing more, but I do think there are limits on what they can do, and at least they're doing a hell of a lot more than the Western governments are doing, and they're not helping Israel. They're not assisting Israel.
So I have to ask. I have to ask them this question. So we're in a full year 2 of so much unspeakable state terrorism that Israel has unleashed on the Palestinian people, as well as their collective punishment and attacks on Lebanon, Syria, even trying to provoke a war with Iran. Now, I don't want to lecture or wag my finger at the Palestinians about how they should resist. International law is clearly on their side, that they have a right to resist, armed or not armed, their oppressors. But given all the destruction and death we see Israel doing with absolute impunity, do you think it was counterproductive of Hamas to launch its attack on October the 7th of last year, kidnap the Israeli and other folks that they did kidnap? And if your answer is no, well then I'm curious your your defense.
That's a very complex question. I mean, so I'll say at the outset that to the extent that there were attacks on civilians, and it does seem that they did, that, I mean, I'm gonna have to try to race through this question because I only have a few minutes left. I've already gone over the time limit that I had set for myself because I got another call I have to deal with this evening. But so what actually happened on October 7th? Okay, there were attacks on military targets and there were attacks on civilians. To the extent that and not only that, but there were multiple groups that took part. It wasn't just Hamas. There were Islamic Jihad took part, and there were other groups, I hadn't even heard of them before, in Gaza who took part. And also there was evidence that once those militants broke through the barrier to the concentration camp, which is what Gaza had become, other Palestinians who weren't part of those forces went through them as well. Okay. Now, once they got on the other side, they inflicted very serious damage on Israeli military targets. That was entirely within their right. I don't criticize that at all. They had no alternative. What are they going to do? You know, in the Great March of Return back in 2018, 2019, they were peacefully walking up to the fence. They have a right to return to their homeland under international law, and they were mercilessly gunned down day after day, even children, disabled persons, medics. You know, a friend of mine who's a doctor was shot twice in the legs. Okay, what are they going to do? They have a right to exercise armed resistance against the military forces. They did that, and good on them. To the extent that they attack civilians, and I'm not talking here about, you know, collateral casualties.
Yeah.
Unintentional. I'm talking about, and there do appear to have been militants who killed people, intentionally civilians. I condemn that, and that's not lawful. But there's still a lot of uncertainty around exactly what happened. So we know, for example, that some of those civilians were killed by Israelis, by the Israeli military, implementing what's known as the Hannibal Directive, because they didn't want any hostages being taken back to Gaza. It's also possible that some of those Palestinians who broke through the barriers, but who weren't part of these organized forces, committed those atrocities. And even if it could be proven that some of the Hamas militants committed intentional killing of civilians or maiming of civilians, it doesn't necessarily mean that that was ordered or authorized by the leadership. These people could have been acting on their own outside of the bounds of the orders that they had been given. We don't know.
Yeah.
I've never seen evidence that Sinwar or Mohammed Deif actually ordered or authorized their forces on that day to attack civilians. If there is evidence, I've not seen it. So these are very complex questions. All I can say at the end of the day is, to the extent that there were attacks on military targets, they were completely legitimate, and calling that terrorism is outrageous. Outrageous. You're going to call that terrorism, but you're not going to call what Israel's doing to the civilian population of Gaza terrorism? I mean, come on, give me a break. Now, in terms of the wisdom of what they did, that's the legality, the wisdom of what they did. Again, I ask the question, it's a very difficult question because so much suffering has been inflicted upon the Palestinian people. But I'll tell you, before October 7th, Youri, if you'd asked me, I wouldn't have said this publicly, but privately, if you'd asked me, I would have said, I feel very pessimistic about the future of the Palestinian people. It seems like the world has forgotten them. Even the Arab states are now doing deals with Israel.
Yep, and the North African ones, and yep,
right.
Yep.
And Israel seems stronger than ever. It seems more legitimate than ever. More and more countries are doing business outside of West Asia with Israel. It's like they've been abandoned to permanent subjugation. Well, I don't think that's the case anymore. Israel is a pariah. The demands for a two-state solution have never been louder. Saudi Arabia is saying, it was on the verge of doing a deal with Israel. It's saying, we will not normalize relations with Israel unless there's a Palestinian state, which is very important. So if you look at the actual impacts on the status of the Palestinian question, one could make a pretty persuasive case that this, even though it's caused enormous suffering in the near term to the Palestinian people, it was tragically the only way for the Palestinians to be heard.
Okay, very, very, very quickly, because I know you have to go soon. I personally it would have been interesting to see had the Palestinians not done their attack, what would have happened with Israel, because Netanyahu was grossly unpopular amongst Israelis for his very unpopular judicial reforms and his very unpopular far-right government. And it rejuvenated the left in Israel, certainly the socially liberal Israeli movement. And I just find that the attack that the Palestinians did was counterproductive, given that the country often unites when an attack happens, and then it gives usually carte blanche to a Netanyahu and Ariel Sharon or Shimon Peres or Omar to do what they are doing. But now, Netanyahu is the most hated politician on the face of planet Earth, even amongst Israelis. So I'm curious your response on that, or do you think it doesn't matter whatever's going on internally between Israel, because what unites Israel, unfortunately, is settler colonialism and hatred for the Palestinians?
Well, if Netanyahu had fallen, if they'd finally rid themselves of that pestilence of a human being, throwing his ass in jail where he belongs, not primarily for corruption. He does belong there for corruption, but primarily because he's a genocidal, psychopathic, sadistic war criminal.
Exactly.
I mean, meant to be rotting in The Hague for the rest of his life. That's too good for him, if you ask me.
Yeah.
But so let's suppose that had happened. Who was going to replace him? Who would have given the Palestinian people justice? Benny Gantz? Are you kidding? Naftali Bennett, a war criminal. Benny Gantz is a war criminal. That clown.
And also Yair Lapid, these are supposed to be the good Zionists, and even the Labor Party itself, which those two both claim that they're for a two-state solution, but they don't want to get rid of the illegal settlements in the West Bank or East Jerusalem, and basically want to control the daily affairs of the Gaza and the people, and still make it into an open air.
100%. Yair Lapid, the Labor Party leader, so-called Labor Party, is fully supportive of the apartheid system they had imposed upon the Palestinian people and the land theft, and just fanatically opposed to a Palestinian state. Who are we kidding here? So it was clear before October 7th, crystal clear, that the only way the Palestinians were going to get a state was if a solution was imposed on Israel from the outside, either by economic sanctions or military intervention or both. That was clear. I don't think that the Palestinians dug themselves a hole by attacking Israel's military assets. I think that they pursued the only option that was available to them.
Final
And
question.
okay, I have to answer that one really quickly.
Okay. Final question. The only game in town is the democratic secular one-state solution, and yet I'm still hearing politicians, even those who claim that they're on the side of the Palestinians, propping up the two-state delusion. What's your response on what's your response to that? And do we have to step our game up in saying that the only just solution is the democratic secular one-state solution, which also deals with the biggest thorny topic, which is the Palestinians' right of return? If you have the democratic secular one-state solution, you deal not only with the right of return, but I'm curious response.
Well, if the Palestinian people are content to accept a state along the 1967 borders or any other borders, and it truly reflects their will, whatever, two-state solution is implemented, that they accept that, I will support their decision. It's their decision. Okay. I'm not going to tell them what they should accept. But if you're asking me, as somebody looking on the outside, what is the most just outcome? I think that a state along the 1967 borders is wildly impractical, because there are 800,000 or so illegal, fanatical, armed settlers living in that land now. There'll be a bloodbath if you try to remove them. And furthermore, I think that the division of historic Palestine along 1967 borders is a grotesque injustice, because it would basically mean that the Palestinians, who at the time of Israel's creation constituted about 2/3 of the population and now constitute a little more than half, depending upon how many people have been massacred in Gaza, would end up with about 20% of the land. So if you were asking me, I don't think I would favor that if I were a Palestinian. But on the other hand, if I had lived through the horrors the Palestinian people have suffered, and I'm confronted by a choice of more war and suffering for my people and taking that deal, I might say, I'll take the shitty deal over, many more years of suffering. But to me, the most just outcome, by all means, would be a single state and a full-blown right of return. And if that means that the Palestinians are a large majority and they will, certainly there should be rights enshrined for everybody in Israel in a constitutional document that is upheld by an independent judiciary, okay? Just like we have in Canada, just like we have in the United States. I fully support that. But I personally think the most just outcome is a one-state solution. And frankly, Youri, I think that's where we're heading. I think for a whole bunch of reasons, which I can't get into now, some of which I've mentioned, but there are others. I think that that's exactly where we're heading.
Well, Dimitri, if you have to go rush off right now, you can. I'm just going to remind the audience who you are and then close the show. Well, we were joined on this edition of 1+1 with Dimitri Lascaris, Canadian lawyer, independent journalist, environmentalist, eco-socialist, anti-imperialist, and social justice activist. As you guys know, he was a member. He ran for the leadership of the Green Party of Canada. He is a member of Disruption Canada, founding member of Green Left Canada, former Real News network correspondent, and now folks, check him out at his Substack, on his YouTube, on all of your socials, and check out his program, Reason to Resist. Dimitri, I hope to have you back on in the future. That way we can talk about Greece and so forth. But until then, keep up the great work you're doing, and power to the people, death to Western imperialism and Zionism, and free Palestine. All right?
Sure. Take care. Bye-bye.
Ciao till then.